The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. My mom's voice was different. Tight, careful, like she was reading from a script she'd practiced. "Jordan, we need to talk about some things your brother has mentioned. We think it's best if you give us some space for a while. For safety reasons." I was standing in my apartment, holding my phone to my ear, trying to understand what she meant. Safety reasons? I worked as an accountant. I went to the gym. I called my parents every Sunday. There was nothing unsafe about any of that. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I asked. "Your father and I just need distance right now. We'll explain more when we're ready. Please respect that." She hung up before I could ask anything else. I stood there in the silence of my apartment, confused and hurt. What had I done? What had Brandon told them? My brother was always calm, always reasonable. If he'd said something to our parents, they would believe him. Everyone always did. 3 days later, my dad sent me an email. No subject line. Just words that felt like they were written in ice. "We've heard some concerning things about your stability and your behavior. Until we understand the full situation, we think you need to work on yourself. We love you, but we need to protect our family." Stability. Behavior. Protect. The words didn't connect to anything real about my life, but they felt heavy with meaning I wasn't supposed to understand. I called my brother Brandon that night. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "Jordan, I only said what I've observed. I care about you, and I'm worried. Mom and Dad should know about the patterns I'm seeing." "What patterns?" "Brandon, I don't even know what you're talking about." "Look, I don't want to get into details right now. I just think you need help, and I think our parents should know that." He said it so gently, like he was truly concerned about me. Like he wasn't destroying my relationship with our parents, he was saving them from danger. I hung up feeling dizzy. The accusation was so vague, so undefined, that I couldn't even defend myself against it. Brandon had always been like this. Growing up, he was the golden child. Smart, confident, charming. He could walk into a room and within minutes, everyone trusted him. Teachers loved him. Coaches believed every word he said. And our parents? They hung on his every achievement. When he called a family meeting 2 weeks later, I should have known something was wrong. He sat across from our parents in our childhood living room, the same room where he'd convinced them I was the problem child when we were teenagers, even though it was him sneaking out at night. "I've been thinking about this for months," he told them, his voice steady and serious. "Jordan has shown signs of instability that I can't ignore anymore. As your son, I have to be honest with you, even though it's hard." My mom leaned forward. My dad's jaw tightened. They were hanging on every word. "I don't feel safe around him," Brandon continued. "And I don't think you should either. Not until he gets help." The words landed like a physical blow. Not safe. Those 3 words changed everything. I made a choice that day, one I would question for years afterward. Instead of fighting, instead of demanding details and explanations, I agreed to step back. Brandon suggested it as a kindness. Let our parents breathe, give them peace of mind, prove that I was stable by accepting their distance without argument. "If you really care about them," he told me on the phone, "you'll give them space to process this. It's the mature thing to do." So I did. I stopped calling. I didn't respond to group texts. When Mom sent me a birthday card in March, I thanked her quietly and didn't push for more. I told myself that time would heal this, that eventually the truth would come out, that patience was a virtue and restraint was proof of my character. Looking back now, I realize I was choosing to disappear to avoid causing trouble. I was silencing myself to protect the family I was being accused of threatening. I was making myself smaller and quieter, hoping that would somehow prove I wasn't the dangerous person Brandon had described. But silence doesn't heal misunderstandings. Silence just gives lies time to grow. 6 months passed, and the distance became a canyon. My cousin mentioned that there was a family dinner last month. Nobody mentioned it to me. My uncle asked me through Facebook Messenger why I hadn't been at Thanksgiving. I hadn't even known there was a Thanksgiving gathering. The stories spread without me knowing what they were. Brandon was the narrator, and he painted me with careful brushstrokes, unreliable, unpredictable, someone to be cautious around. I'd sometimes see photos on social media of family events I wasn't invited to. My little cousins no longer asked me to help with their homework. My aunt started responding to my messages with shorter and shorter replies until the replies stopped coming altogether. The worst part wasn't the rejection. It was the fact that nobody ever told me what I'd actually done. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Invisible, spreading, impossible to fight because it had no clear shape. And my absence from these gatherings became proof of my guilt. If I was innocent, wouldn't I be there fighting to clear my name? By the 1-year mark, the story had taken on a life of its own. I ran into an old friend at the coffee shop, and she was suddenly awkward around me. Not hostile, just distant. Like she'd been warned about me. "Are you okay?" she asked, and I could hear the pity in her voice. "Yeah, why wouldn't I be? I just heard through the grapevine that your family was worried about you. That you'd been struggling." I didn't ask what grapevine. I already knew. Brandon had woven himself into conversations across my entire extended family. A concerned brother sharing his fears with aunts and uncles who naturally cared about their relatives. He never said anything specific enough to sound like a lie, but vague enough to sound like a warning. My reputation was being rewritten without my knowledge, and I was powerless to stop it. People who'd known me my whole life were now seeing me as someone broken, unstable, dangerous. And the person responsible was the one person our family trusted completely. I was alone in my apartment one evening, scrolling through old photos, when something caught my eye. A memory from Facebook. 3 years ago, a family camping trip. Brandon and I were both there. In the comments, my mom had written about an incident that weekend. I remembered now. An argument over something stupid. Brandon had twisted it into something it wasn't, and our parents had sided with him. But there was more. There were other moments I'd blocked out. Times when Brandon had misrepresented situations. Times when I'd noticed his stories didn't quite match what actually happened. But each time, I'd assumed I was misremembering. He was Brandon. He wouldn't lie. He couldn't lie. I started writing things down. Small inconsistencies. The camping trip story. A time in college when he'd claimed I'd said something I never said. A situation 2 years ago that he'd retold to our parents in a way that made me look worse than I actually was. Each one was small enough to dismiss, but together they formed a pattern. What if he hadn't just lied recently? What if this was something he'd always done? I made a deliberate choice to listen more carefully after that. When Brandon texted me or called, I paid attention not just to what he said, but to how he said it. How he framed situations. How he positioned himself as the concerned family member watching over a troubled sibling. I didn't confront him. I didn't argue. I just listened. And I started keeping records. The truth was beginning to feel within reach, but I had to be careful. If I confronted Brandon without evidence, without proof, it would be my word against his. And whose word would our parents trust? The golden child who'd been warning them about me, or the unstable one who was now suddenly claiming her brother had been lying? I needed something concrete. I needed documentation. I needed something that couldn't be twisted or explained away. The turning point came when I was looking through some old files on my computer. I found an email from 7 years ago, a notification about a police report. I'd completely forgotten about it. It was from a minor incident, something that had been resolved quickly and quietly. But more importantly, it had official documentation. My heart started racing. I could request that report. I could see exactly what had happened, what was officially recorded, what couldn't be denied or reinterpreted. I wasn't even sure if the report would help. It was old. It might not be relevant. But it was something real, something written down by people who weren't my family, who had no stake in defending me or attacking me. That night, I filled out the request form. My hands were shaking. I was taking the first real step toward proving that the narrative my brother had built was constructed on lies. 2 weeks after I submitted my request, Brandon sent me a text. It was unusual. "We rarely talked anymore. I think it's time we all moved on from this," he wrote. "I don't think you should come to family events. It's better for everyone if we maintain this distance permanently. I think Mom and Dad would agree." He was pushing for finality. For a permanent break. For a world in which I was simply erased from the family. Why would he do that now? Why would he push to make the separation permanent right at this moment? Unless he sensed something. Unless he knew I was looking for answers and was trying to prevent me from finding them. The police report arrived on a Friday in a plain manila envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it. I sat on my couch and read every single word, 3 times. What I found wasn't what I expected. The report contained documentation of an incident from 7 years ago, a situation that had nothing to do with what Brandon had been telling our parents. In fact, the report showed something completely different. It showed that I hadn't done what my brother had implied. It showed a resolution that contradicted his entire narrative. More importantly, it showed dates. Official dates. Times. Names of witnesses. A record of what actually happened, written down by people who had no reason to protect me or hurt me. They just recorded the truth. I read the report over and over that weekend, seeing my whole situation with new clarity. If Brandon had lied about this, if he'd twisted this incident into something it wasn't to convince our parents I was unstable, what else had he lied about? How far did this go? The realization was both crushing and freeing. Brandon hadn't just recently started manipulating our family. This was who he was. This was what he did. He took situations and reframed them to position himself as the hero and everyone else as the problem. He was charming enough that people believed him. And he was smart enough to make it seem like he was acting out of concern and love. I wasn't unstable. I wasn't dangerous. I was the victim of someone very good at controlling narratives. I spent the next week analyzing everything through this new lens. The camping trip. Brandon had exaggerated my role in an argument to make me look volatile. The college situation. He'd attributed something he'd said to me to make me look unreliable. The reason our parents had suddenly turned cold. He'd woven a careful story that made me seem like a threat. And the motive? That was the piece that took longer to understand. Brandon had built himself up by tearing me down. Our parents' attention, their resources, their trust, these were finite things. By making me seem unstable and unreliable, he positioned himself as the stable, trustworthy son. By making me seem dangerous, he became the protector. It was brilliant, really. In a horrible way. He'd managed to isolate me from my entire family without anyone ever knowing it was intentional. I didn't rush to share the police report. I thought carefully about when and how to reveal the truth. Blowing up with anger wouldn't work. Coming at Brandon accusingly would just let him spin the narrative again. I needed a moment where the documentation spoke for itself, where he couldn't reframe or reinterpret. I needed witnesses. Our family reunion was scheduled for August. A big gathering at my aunt's house. Everyone would be there. Parents, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles. The perfect setting for Brandon to continue building his story. The perfect setting for me to reveal the truth. My mom sent me an invitation. A small olive branch. I think she was tired of the distance, but she wasn't sure how to bridge it without Brandon's permission. I responded immediately saying I'd be there. I could feel Brandon's plan crumbling. He'd been building toward a permanent separation, and now I was coming back into the picture. I showed up at my aunt's house on a Saturday afternoon in August. The driveway was full of cars. Through the window, I could see my extended family scattered throughout the living room, eating and laughing and catching up. The conversation stopped when I walked in. Not entirely. It was too public for that. Too many witnesses. But there was a shift. A visible tension. Everyone suddenly remembered the story they'd been told. The unstable sibling. The one who'd been cut off for everyone's safety. Jordan, my mom said, standing up. Her voice was uncertain. She wanted to hug me, I think, but she also wasn't sure if that was allowed. Hi, Mom. I kept my voice calm and steady. I could feel Brandon's eyes on me from across the room. He looked less confident than he had in recent years. He looked like someone whose plan had just shifted in an unexpected direction. Brandon didn't waste much time. Within 20 minutes, he'd maneuvered our parents into a quiet corner of the kitchen, where he probably thought I couldn't hear. But I could. I'd positioned myself carefully, and I was listening. I'm just saying, he told them, his voice full of gentle concern. I'm not sure this is a good idea. Jordan showing up here without warning, without really dealing with the issues. I'm worried about how this will affect everyone. My dad looked conflicted. My mom looked sad. Maybe we should give her a chance, my mom said quietly. I want to, Brandon replied. I really do. But I care about our family too much to pretend that the problems aren't still there. He said it so earnestly. If I hadn't read the police report, if I hadn't spent months analyzing his patterns, I might have believed him. That was his gift. Making lies sound like truth, making manipulation sound like care. I walked into the kitchen and placed the police report on the counter. It was simple. It was quiet. It was devastating. I think there's something everyone should see, I said. The kitchen went silent. Every single person stopped what they were doing. My brother's face went pale. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't accuse. I just pointed to the official document, my name on it, the dates, the facts recorded by people who had nothing to do with our family drama. This is from 7 years ago, I said, my voice steady. This is what actually happened. Not Brandon's version. Not the story he's been telling you. The actual truth, documented and filed. My parents read the report slowly. My dad's face changed. My mom's hands started to shake. They were seeing something different from what they'd been told. They were seeing official proof that contradicted years of carefully constructed narrative. Brandon, my dad said, looking up from the document. This doesn't match what you told us. My brother's response was quick. Defensive. That report is incomplete. It doesn't show the whole picture. Jordan was involved in other things that... Were those other things documented? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. Because this one is. This one has witnesses. Names. Dates. Timestamps. This one isn't just a story. This one is a fact. The anger came slowly, replacing the confusion on my parents' faces. They were beginning to understand what had happened. Their trusted son, their golden child, had been lying to them. Not just about me, but about the whole situation. Every concern he'd expressed, every warning he'd given, every distance he'd encouraged, it had been built on a foundation of lies. Why would you do this? My mom asked Brandon, and her voice was breaking. I was trying to help, he said, but even he could hear how hollow that sounded now. You were trying to isolate her, my dad said, understanding flooding into his words. You were trying to turn us against her. Brandon stood up. This is ridiculous. You don't understand the situation. You're taking her side without. Without what? I asked. Without believing your story? You're right. Now we're believing the truth instead. The rest of the family had gone quiet. They were watching this unfold, understanding that the narrative they'd been told was collapsing. The people who'd avoided me at family dinners, who'd been distant and careful around me, they were seeing the truth now. It was uncomfortable. It was public. It was humiliating for everyone involved. But it was honest. For the first time in 7 years, the family was facing reality instead of Brandon's version of it. Someone in the living room started talking, trying to move past the moment. But the damage was done. Everyone knew now. Everyone understood that the brother they'd trusted had manipulated them all. My parents didn't know what to do with me after that. The apology was awkward and insufficient. 7 years of distance can't be erased in a single afternoon, no matter how sincere the regret. We're sorry, my mom said. We should have asked you more questions. We should have listened to your side. Yeah, I said, and I meant it without anger. You should have. My dad tried to touch my shoulder, but I stepped back gently. I wasn't ready to accept comfort from people who'd abandoned me so easily. They'd chosen to believe Brandon's story without evidence. They'd let him isolate me without question. The fact that they'd finally figured out the truth didn't automatically fix that. I don't know if we can just go back to how things were, I told them. But maybe we can figure out how things could be going forward. I set clear boundaries with my family. I would rebuild relationships, but on different terms. I wouldn't pretend the past 7 years didn't happen. I wouldn't act like Brandon's manipulation had never occurred. And I wouldn't participate in family gatherings where he was present until he'd done real work to understand what he'd done. The power of having documentation, of having proof, meant that nobody could deny what had happened or gaslight me into accepting a watered-down version of events. The police report wasn't just important because it cleared my name. It was important because it gave me back control of my own narrative. Brandon's influence over my story had ended the moment that document went on the table. Within a few months, my family situation had changed completely. Brandon moved out of my parents' house, seeking his own place. His reputation, which had been so carefully constructed, crumbled faster than it had been built. People who'd heard his warnings about me were now re-examining all his stories with skepticism. My cousin called me and apologized for believing the narrative. My uncle reached out to ask my side of things. My parents slowly began including me in family decisions again, and more importantly, they started asking me for my perspective before trusting someone else's version of events. The consequences for Brandon were natural and appropriate. He'd built his power on lies, and when the lies were exposed, the power evaporated. A year after the family reunion, I'm not just back in contact with my family. I'm genuinely building healthier relationships with them. But I'm doing it as someone who knows who I am, not as someone desperately trying to prove who I'm not. The police report is still safely filed away. I don't need to carry it with me anymore, but I know it's there. It represents more than documentation of a single incident from 7 years ago. It represents the moment when I reclaimed my own narrative from someone who'd been controlling it. Brandon's lie didn't just hurt me in the moment. It shaped 7 years of my life, my relationships, my self-perception. But the truth, when I finally found it, did more than clear my name. It gave me back my future. And the most powerful part wasn't the revenge or the consequences Brandon faced. It was the clarity. I know who I am now, and no one gets to tell me otherwise.